Hi everyone, my name is Imma Ramos and I'm the curator of the South Asia collections at the British Museum. I'm very happy to be here speaking on this multidisciplinary panel, and I'm excited to reflect on the theme that we're all discussing, navigating change in the creative sector. We're all aware of how deeply COVID has impacted museum visits throughout last year and this year. As someone who had an exhibition on in the midst of the pandemic, I thought it would be helpful to share some of my learnings from this experience. The title of the show was Tantra, Enlightenment to Revolution, and it was scheduled to open in April 2020. However, by mid-March, all UK non-essential services had shut down to help limit the spread of the virus, including all the national museums in London. This first closure of the BM pushed Tantra's start date to September. It had to close again during the second and third lockdowns in November and December, so in total the show was open for 55 days, which was half of its anticipated run period. While it was open, it sold out every weekend, demonstrating not only a strong interest in the subject, but also a public desire to support the arts. The exhibition aimed to demystify Tantra and challenge the stereotype that it's a hedonistic guide to sex. Tantra is an Indian philosophy which affirms all aspects of the material world as sacred and infused with divine feminine power. It teaches that enlightenment can be achieved rapidly by actively engaging with spiritual obstacles such as desire, aversion, and fear, in order to ultimately transcend them. Tantric imagery is therefore unique in its inclusion of erotic and macabre symbolism. The central aim of the show and the accompanying book was to present the first historical exploration of tantric visual culture, from its origins in India to its reimagining in the West. The exhibition was divided into 4 major sections which explored Tantra's link to successive waves of revolutionary thought, from its early medieval transformation of Hinduism and Buddhism to the Indian fight for independence and the rise of 1960s counterculture in the West. So how did we attempt to navigate the periods of lockdown? We were keen to ensure that people from within and beyond London would have the opportunity to experience the exhibition, even if they couldn't make it in person. So we released a virtual tour of the show, which provided an introduction to Tantra, as well as the highlights on display. To date, it's had over 850,000 views across Facebook and YouTube. The events programme accompanying Tantra was also adapted and delivered almost entirely online, rather than on-site as originally envisaged. The upshot of this was that we actually reached a far wider global audience. Over 100,000 people engaged with the events and viewers tuned in from over 50 countries. Events included a performance by acclaimed musician Parvati Baul, streamed live from India, as well as the creation of a sand mandala dedicated to the goddess Vajra Yogini, streamed live from Bhutan. There were also fantastic talks with scholars, including Vidya Dahejia, Madhu Khanna, Jessica Fraser, and Neela Chanagsang, as well as a panel exploring the impact of Tantra on modern and contemporary art with artists whose work featured in the show, including Bhartika and Shuthapa Biswas. As well as being able to tune in live to these events, people could also catch up with them afterwards on YouTube, and they're still up on the BM Events channel for people to enjoy, so that also means they have a longer lifespan. This has the major benefit of granting not only greater accessibility for the public, but also providing the show with an afterlife and legacy it wouldn't have had otherwise. Apart from the benefits of continuing to reach out to audiences online, what else can be learned from the experience of curating the Tantra show? I'd like to share just a few takeaways. The first is the importance of collaboration. This part of the exhibition that you can see explored the role of human remains in Tantric Buddhist practice, which was developed in consultation with members of the Tibetan community, as well as practitioners and scholars of Tibetan Buddhism. The objects we talked about in the workshops were originally used in a ritual context, and as a collective, our aim was to demystify their role in Tibetan cultural practice. The use of human remains is a reminder of the impermanence of the body. The workshops really shone a light on different cultural attitudes to death. Ultimately, in the exhibition, we included participants' voices and perspectives via audio stops. An evaluation from the exhibition shows how important that was for visitors. One point that emerged was a desire to reactivate the ritual instruments in consultation with specialist practitioners. In one of the audio stops, visitors could listen to Lama Rinzin, a Tibetan monk from the Kagyu tradition based in Sheffield, as he performed an abbreviated version of the Chur ritual using a thigh-bone trumpet and drum. The goal of this practice is to sever all ties to the idea of a fixed self. The value of sharing interpretive power and engaging in dialogue with both academic and non-academic colleagues beyond the museum walls is clear in order to promote innovative approaches to interpreting the collection. I learned so much from the experience and look forward to engaging in future opportunities for collaboration and co-curation. Another lesson learnt from curating the Tantra show was the power of incorporating immersive digital experiences. This space evoked an imaginative recreation of one of the most famous tantric temples in India, which is dedicated to Yogini goddesses and was built around the 10th century. We wanted to transport visitors to a time when devotion to these goddesses was at its height. Here is the original temple in Odisha in eastern India. Most Yogini temples were circular and unique in their roofless design, perhaps in order to attract the Yoginis from the sky into the sacred courtyard. In the exhibition, we show 12 of the 64 Yoginis which encircle the temple's interior walls. Here are details of some of the Yoginis at Odisha. Some stand and dance upon animals that they can shapeshift into. Others balance upon corpses and dismembered heads, and some drink from skull cups. For the imaginative evocation of the temple, we took inspiration from medieval Sanskrit texts, which describe the kinds of tantric rituals that may have been carried out within these spaces, including the consumption and offering of wine, blood and flesh, which were believed to energize the Yoginis. These specialist rituals were considered most effective when carried out at night. The temple would have also invited devotional worship from visitors during the day, so we wanted to play with that idea of private and public forms of devotion by evoking the temple in nocturnal and daytime settings. The space in the show draws imagery and inspiration from the Odisha temple without attempting to replicate it exactly. We worked with a company called Center Screen to achieve this, using a mix of graphics, lighting and projection. In a moment, I'm going to play you the 3-minute film that visitors experienced when they walked into the space. You'll have to try and imagine it as a 360-degree experience. As you watch the film, you'll notice that it becomes more creative and evocative during the nocturnal scene. Since Yoginis could fly and also shapeshift into women, birds, snakes, tigers or jackals as the mood took them, we wanted to subtly suggest the flight and shapeshifting powers of the Yoginis using different aesthetic effects. For example, the flight of birds and bats. The challenge, of course, was to do this without it feeling orientalist or exoticizing. It was important to keep this creative part of the film simple and to ground it in the words of Sanskrit texts describing the Yoginis. We also decided to hone in on details of the Yogini sculptures themselves, including their attributes such as cobras and skull cups, and amplify them as another way of grounding the creative approach and highlighting the primary source material.
Japen mantro mahasattvo vigvaso dakshinamukha saptaratrena yoginyo agachanti mahabhaya raudrupas tatha shudha sakrodha maranatmika tadrushva tu nabhetavyam virasatrena mantra.
To those eternal yoginis, by whose glory the three worlds have been established, to them I bow down, to them I pray. Whether fierce or gentle, terrible to behold, all-powerful, residing in the sky, on earth or in the vastness of space, may those yoginis always be well disposed towards me.
I suddenly saw that my friends, the yoginis, having flown upward, were roaming about in the field of the sky, each by means of her own supernatural power. I called in amazement and made them descend from the sky. The practitioner of Great Spirit should recite the mantra naked, facing south.
After 7 nights, the yoginis come.
Highly dangerous, with terrifying forms, impure, angry, and lethal.
The ornamental designs on their cheeks were painted with blood, which was being lapped up by the many snakes adorning their ears.
Sparks rising from the third eye on their foreheads were fanned into flames by the gaspings of the helpless serpents, ruthlessly enmeshed in the tangled masses of their hair.
They tell truly the future, good and bad.
If by mistake a practitioner of weak spirit should tremble, the yoginis, arrogant with their yoga, devour him that very moment.
In our evaluation findings, this immersive part of the show was a standout feature for visitors. They felt it gave a sense of time and place. I learnt a lot about the importance of digital innovation with scholarship at its heart through the experience of working on the temple evocation. New technologies must be mastered and used by museums to bring research and interpretation to wider audiences and encourage greater engagement. The final lesson I wanted to end with relates to a major section of the exhibition that looks at how Tantra was harnessed for its insurgent potential during the fight for Indian independence in the late 19th century. Indian revolutionaries in Bengal reimagined tantric goddesses such as Kali as symbols of an independent India rising up against the British. This was one of the most popular sections of the exhibition amongst visitors, according to our audience evaluation, and showed a real public appetite for engaging in colonial critique. For example, one visitor said, quote, "I really appreciated the framing and honesty around Britain's role in suppressing and demonising Tantra, owning and acknowledging British history," end quote. For me, this was about the need to emphasise alternative perspectives on empire by foregrounding the voices and agency of those under colonial rule. As curators, we need to develop new ways of interpreting objects that foreground multivocal experiences and challenge preconceptions of the past. But this was also about engaging with our institutional past via more transparent approaches to collecting histories. Another visitor pointed out that, quote, "The exhibition actively acknowledged the colonial past linked to the acquisition of the objects. I like that this put them into context," end quote. The provenance of objects in the exhibition was explored in more detail in a dedicated page on the museum's website. Beyond the exhibition, I look forward to exploring colonial-era material in the collection with the aim of decentering Eurocentric narratives, which will also involve a need for institutional self-reflexivity. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to be here. And I'm Yarli Allison, and also thank you, Imma, for absolutely stunning and beautiful presentation. To just give you a little bit of background, I was born in Canada of Hong Kong heritage under British colonial era. And I'm just passing by Hong Kong right now, and I usually base between London and Paris. And as you see, I was trained in sculpture originally and installation at the Slate in London. But I became much more multidisciplinary in pandemic times. And I will talk about two works that I had largely shifted my original plans and to overcome the lockdown challenges, and how I found myself exploring with new methods and aesthetics, and just thinking about digital humanity in general and the responsibility as an artist in our times. And so when I first acquired virtual reality, the VR tool, I just moved to Northern Ireland from London. And with a little bit of unsure where I am or where will I be next, I felt the urge to recreate somewhere familiar, and to begin testing this VR immersiveness of the virtual space. I chose to draw somewhere I felt familiar with, which is my childhood home in Canada, but I couldn't return to anymore. So during the process, one memory led to another, and the space came to life around me, as well as the emotions and sensations that I didn't knew they're still in me. So I start to investigate if there are also other people who couldn't return to somewhere that they felt belong, like a home that doesn't exist anymore physically, like because of probably multiple factors like migration or city gentrification. So I work with a diaspora anthropologist focusing on East Asian sector, and invited a writer friend, and we began to conduct interviews after a long process of try to gather materials and then drawing their memories in VR. After that, we invited these people back to the fake but emotionally believable space, and then they began to tell the stories. So one scenario was that on the left, that their family used to hang out around that living room, let's say on that sofa. But ever since they've came out from the closets, the family kind of fell apart, and then in the end, they were sent to the UK for study. So when we came back to Hong Kong, the house, the apartment was not the same anymore, or even for some people doesn't exist anymore. So that notion of family is attached to that space and in that specific moment as well, but never had a chance to remedy. So using the VR research method, I try to solve the sense of belonging and something that is intangible. And in the process, it provides this alternative perspective and understanding of the past. And as they slowly encounter the trains of thoughts and then reorganize them, they can give new meanings, hopefully, and to the notions of home, and perhaps even offering a closure. And to collecting these highly personal memories or oral history, it's very easy for us to fall into the trap of simplifying or to lumping every 1990s Hong Kong British migrants in one category. So we try to emphasize the plurality, the complexity of one diaspora stories, and because they're incredibly honest materials that falls on my shoulder. So if it's not because of the pandemic or the rise of the fake news, the yellow peril, or even the instability of political climate of in Hong Kong, or even international intensified border controls that I experience, and the surveillance of biometric data collecting and tracking. If I haven't been experiencing all these, I wouldn't think that much of disguising the information that was given to me, and of forming even alternative metaphors. So it was challenging in thinking what to disclose or to protect, especially when a lot of people risk their lives to make their voice heard, or to even make art that they felt are genuine to their principles. So what came out of this is that I think more people, I think more about how can I process and present my works in general, much more relatable to the community. Like instead of using technology to solve a digital problem, now I think about how to maybe shift the focus back to the people and that my works are representing. And for example, here you can see one of the research process that I didn't make the color decisions for them. The colors are remotely chosen by the interviewees that they think are best to represent their memories of their homes and the characters. And as an artist, I have to figure out how to navigate between these restrictions. But I felt like it's more important to give them the power than my aesthetic freedom here. So I just flipped through the show, this is the VR gear and the installation in the end. And so also navigating around the dependency of powerful AI creative tools. I wanted to experiment with digital aesthetics that are not, let's say, lazy. And by embedding some of the hand traces, like with my drawings. And so here you see a hand drawing of a sound wave audio spectrum that is usually seen in digital editing softwares. And then I will ask, what can I do with my drawing, sculpture, installation background, even with human performances? How can we make the process, although it's super labor intensive and very inconvenient, but then I want to force myself to find new ways and to layer these together and to think about human traces in our AI era. And then we can think about ownership and preservation after. And so the second work sparks my interest on datafied body, policy systems like border control I mentioned before, or the future of like humanity in relationship with technology. So when COVID hits, I just moved to France while I was doing this work. I plan to go back and forth to London from France just to film Latifia, who's in the photo, a dominatrix and a collaborator. And in this work, she shared her duality of sex workers, real experience in an extremely reflective, political, and poetic way. So I was highly aware of the difficulties crossing the borders right after Brexit and during the COVID pandemic time. It was almost impossible to just go and film and come back without a European status at that time. And I was stuck between countries and not having a home to return to at that time. So it was challenging to make this work. And we had to abandon the original idea of filming in a real sex dungeon. And I came up with this labor-intensive idea of building this sex dungeon digitally and in my style. So if it's not for the challenges, this work would have been very different. It would be maybe very documentary-like and also in the ordinary, usual, pinky, black, red, neon style that we would usually have the preconception about. And I also mixed a real performer with this digital character to form an alternative narrative that is aligned with her many personas. According to Letty, traits like naive or submissive or feminine are highly desirable in the mainstream fantasy. So in real life, she's an intelligent, independent, highly educated, even queer activist. So in my understanding, this fictional persona probably helped her to cope or to survive, but also to feed into clients' fantasy. So choosing this a natural, gender-conforming color, we present her as this absurd ideal female under the mainstream man's gaze in a very dystopian way, and to bridge between a client's fantasy and the digital reality in her own voice, in her own narration. And in the end, because I wasn't restricted to existing materials like the existing dungeons, that I take it for granted probably. And the creative process became much more imaginative, like and more metaphorical. It opens up interpretation. And to sum up, this crazy pandemic journey has led me thinking about the authentic human side of stories, human and technology relationships, and even the aesthetic decisions were totally changed. And listening to the stories directly from the people who are in the field and to talk with them and also to acknowledge what people truly need, how by asking questions, then we can resituate our prejudgments, bias, policymaking, and also be aware of how history and society is formed under a spectrum of perspectives and agendas. And in the end, finally, if you want to see any full-length video, it's not published publicly, but welcome to send me a message. And it's been an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
name is Aakash Odedra, and I'm a dancer and a choreographer and the artistic director of my own company. Now, the trailer that you just saw right now is a trailer of a production called Samsara. I've chose this production for a few specific reasons. One, for me, it's a very special piece because it speaks about life and death. And two, there was life before Samsara, life on the premiere of Samsara, and life after Samsara. And those fragments have now become three different worlds for me because in each one of those phases, I felt like I had reincarnated in each one. Like the cycle of life and death actually had taken place during each one. It's also a piece which was sponsored by the Bagri Foundation and a journey that they had also come on with me. Now, during the creation of Samsara, which started in 2017, life was as I knew it. So I had trained in Kathak and Bharatanatyam, and all my work was very contemporary dominated in a way because I felt like the contemporary medium was something that spoke to audiences around the globe because I was traveling a lot. So during this creation process, it was very interesting because I was working with a Chinese dancer called Hu Shenwan, who doesn't speak any English and I don't speak any Chinese. But we spoke with a different language, and this world felt very interesting to me. So we developed on it and we developed the piece as we would normally develop a piece during any of my processes. And there was a lot of research and development and finding what is the essence of samsara or this cycle of life and death. And also, ironically, it was about a monk making a journey from China to India. And during that time, it was illegal, it was forbidden by the emperor for anyone to leave China. But he wanted to make this journey to retrieve original Sanskrit Buddhist scriptures and texts to bring back to the people. Now, before this monk, there was around 54 monks which had attempted the journey from China to India and had not succeeded. However, this monk had succeeded and stayed in India and come back, and it took him 14 years. But what was interesting for me was the imagery of this monk making this journey across different landscapes, across the Gobi Desert, through the Himalayan peaks to reach his destination. And a thought came to me about this monk, and the thought was: Is the monk an incarnation of the 54 monks that had tried to make this journey? And every time this same soul got to a certain point, it's almost like when he passed away, his energy had become like a residual energy, and every time he tried to make this journey, he was getting closer and closer to his destination. So as I was thinking of this, I came across these figurines here at Aditi Mangal house. So for me, they were like moments captured in time, frozen moments in space, in time. And it really inspired me to make large, real life figurines because for me, they represented moments in time. Just like I had life before samsara, during samsara, and after samsara. So life during some before in the creation of samsara was an average creation, how we would create, but then the pandemic started to hit and everything started to shift. We just about managed to premiere the work, and we did the premiere in Melbourne. So it was 4 years of work, and then we did the premiere in Melbourne International Festival, and that was the last piece that showed. We got back, and the pandemic was in full swing, and everything went into lockdown, and life changed from that point. What was interesting is during my life, I've spent most of my life trying to look at different perspectives, life from varying perspectives. Often we see things on the news, often we see a lot of information, and I always tend to put myself in that person's shoe. What are they feeling? And I always felt that in life there's no wrong or right. And I was working on a project about refugees, and it's a place that I put myself, and I try to draw on that point of feeling in limbo, not knowing where I'm losing my own identity and regaining a new identity, a new incarnation. So here in this situation, my practice was very different before the pandemic, and as the pandemic happened, it forced me to stop dancing and become an observer. So for me, life became my teacher more so. It was always the case. But simple things like being able to sit in my garden and see an acer budding, seeing the leaves go from green to pink to red, and seeing that whole cycle of life and death. On one hand, in Samsara, before I was talking about life and death and perspectives, and here now I was experiencing life, death, and all the shades in between that. So it was a very difficult time. And in this time, the pandemic saw no difference between a king, or a worker or an average person. Everyone became equal. So my practice started to reflect that as well. For some reason, it felt like I couldn't dance. I had to understand what was happening in life and around me. So for me, it was important to be able to, at the same time as being an observer, disconnect from the world to reconnect inside. And I did a practice where I locked myself into a room for 3 days, 3 nights, no food, no water, no dance, no mobile, no nothing, and just sat there and meditated for 3 days and 3 nights, simply to observe and reflect on life within me and my experiences, and how I was going to draw on those experiences to then externalize it and share with people, the audience, because I think it's really important for me to be able to truly understand um, where my emotional state of being is, to be able to then relate it to the other person or to see life from the eyes of the other person. First, one has to really understand themselves. So I think this practice of observation became something that happened as a result of the pandemic. And I think this was really, really life changing for me. It was a big moment because often we do productions, and these productions have to relate to people because ultimately you are connecting to people. But this was a time where the audience had been removed. There was no one to applaud. There was no one to give critique on a composition. I became my own critique. My eyes became my audience. My ears became my teachers. The sound had a different importance. So my practice started to shift, and it wasn't necessarily dance as a physicality, but it was dance as an exploration of life, dance as an observation of life. And it was really, really important for me because when I looked back at samsara, it felt like a different world and a different incarnation. I felt within this 1 year that there had been such a shift within myself that I had to question going forward, what was I going to do? Was I going to continue life in the way I understood it and work in the way I had always worked? And it always felt like um, a hamster wheel. The quicker I run, the faster this wheel kept spinning. And this was the first time this wheel stopped. And for me, this became a very important pivotal point. There are projects which I was about to do, which were commercially very popular and very important for the company and for the work that we had planned initially. But what I had done is I shifted all of that and I went right back to my roots. And I thought this was a very important practice for me to go back to zero. I decided to do a production which connected to Kathak, which connected to Bharatnatyam, and which scaled back on its size and came back to simplicity. Even now, after 28 years of dancing, I have started to now learn from a dancer who's the same age as me, but I had started from my absolute kindergarten alphabet because I felt it was important for us as humanity, as peoples, to go back to some form of simplicity and some form of reconnection to where we have come from. And I think for me, this important lesson that I have learned is something that I want to take forward now. It's important to be able to retain this idea of simplicity and connectivity to humans. As we've all been isolated from people around the world, it made that connectivity and that yearning, that sense of wanting to seek knowledge, just like the monk that made the journey from China to India, all that more important. And for me, there's a saying that I always live by. Wisdom is knowledge applied, knowledge is power, and experience is your true teacher. And I think this experience of the pandemic and this whole state of being has shifted us. It has shifted my practice and how I will connect to people on different levels and be able to see life from a more empathetic point of view. So I feel that this production, Samsara, had these three incarnations, before, during, and after. And I think this has also been reflective of me and my practice. And this is something that I'm now planting into my company. And we are making change now in the company and trying to bring this new way of thinking, which is to be able to reinvent, recalibrate, and realign ourselves so that we are able to now see life from a very different perspective and bring this positive change. There's been a lot of death around us, but I think from this death, I feel there's been a new incarnation within me. As hard as it feels like for me to say that, I feel like death has given me a new sense of meaning in life.
Thank you so much, Akash and Yarli, for those inspiring talks. I feel that I've learnt so much, and it's just fantastic to hear these multidisciplinary perspectives on how we're navigating creative change during this really difficult time for the arts sector across the board. And for me, I think it's something that really stood out in both your cases, in your work. I sensed so much empathy and a desire to connect with others through the work that you're creating that you created during this time. As Akash put it, seeing life from the perspective of others. I think that came through really strongly through Yardi's VR homes, through Akash's sort of radical practices of observation. So I felt really moved by that. But we have some time now also for a few questions. A few questions have come through from the audience, and I have the first one for Akash. Akash, being a dancer, how did you tackle the inability to move around physically during lockdown? Do you have any advice for us? You talked about that, disconnecting from the world to reconnect within. But maybe you could say more about, how, for example, I know you've been teaching online, you've been leading virtual performances. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that too.
I would be lying if I said I was devastated, but it was a blessing for me. It was a blessing because for the last 12 years, I have been doing 48 countries in 6 months. So I've just been dancing. And for the last 28 years, I have been dancing. So I've never ever been able to separate dance from myself. I've never been able to appreciate dance in that sense because I've never seen it as anything different. So what this 14 months has done of not dancing, I'm not going to consider the workshops I have done as real like dance because I feel there's a difference when you know when you push yourself when you're on stage, and it's a very different experience. So I'm going to say I've not really danced, but I've danced in my mind, and I've appreciated what it's done for me. So for me, it came as a blessing. I'm suffering the consequences now as I reopen the Curve Theatre next month, because it's now starting from zero for me again. But I feel like this was a very important time for me. It allowed me to understand the importance of what dance actually does for me, because I was able to step away from it. Because dance for me has been, it's like a relationship. You love it, you hate it, you can't live with it, you can't live without it, you separate from it, you want to get back together with it. So I've been through this whole wave of emotions the whole way through, and now I'm rekindling my relationship, my love, my passion with dance. Soon as I finish this, I'm going to put my bells back on and get lost in that world again. So it's like meeting an old friend again. So I think the break in that way has been a blessing, but now coming back to the reality of going on stage is going to be another question altogether. So yeah.
Thank you, Akash. And for Yarli, there's another question. Since you've made work digitally for years, did you feel differently towards your work during this particular period? Did you discover something new? I feel like actually you've tackled that a lot in your presentation, but and actually one thing that really stood out for me was your work with virtual reality, which I was really excited to hear about. And I wonder if, I suppose when I've read and experienced virtual reality, there's always a tension between the idea of escapism, or rather, that's perhaps what I would associate with virtual reality, is the idea of escaping into another world. But I feel like you did something really interesting, and you were talking about this idea of confrontation. So you were sort of allowing people to perhaps confront their pasts through these projects that you were sort of helping them navigate. Maybe you could say something about that idea, that tension between escapism versus confrontation in your VR home series, and that idea of closure and healing that you talked briefly about.
Thank you, Imma. For the for the new part, I like new ideas or new exploration. I think this has been really a dramatic change in thinking about how not to be relying on the convenience part of the digital tools. Like with a click of a button, you can do a lot of things, and I try to not try to disassemble that a little bit, and that's why I emphasize like labor intensive. It's really important, I think, for now in my practice, especially with especially I come from this really hand making physical background, and also so that's why like when I was reading about VR tools, the possibility of it, I actually started from a psychological point of view, and I read a lot of journals and scientific research on how to build this immersiveness and how to utilize them to connect with people, and even helping people experiencing PTS symptoms, and to put yourself in other people's shoes, but not but try not to force them into a situation that they do not wish to experience. And for some people, the usage of VR, it's really it's really about like creating the fear and creating that impact of shock, so you can have the stimulation with the technology. But for me, I really want to find a humanity side, or create empathy, as you say, as you use the word, to just try to let people in a little bit and open up a conversation that is not so much about an answer. So using this technology, I think it has like endless possibilities, and whatever future arts it's about the immersiveness, it might just start in this really heavy headset right now. So I'm really looking forward to experience more in this technology, and see how scientists work with them as well, so it could inspire more art making.
Fantastic. I can't wait to see how your work develops and also how Akash's work develops. I think, there's so many new developments in both of your works. So I think we have a lot to look forward to. There has been a question that came through for me was, after years in the making for Tantra, what elements of the exhibition did you think about first in your attempt to digitize the exhibition for those who could no longer see it in person? Well, I mentioned the importance of the online public program and the virtual tour. And one of the other, I would say one of the most exciting elements that came out of that was a collaborative film that we made with Dashrakama Ura, who's the president of the Centre for Bhutan Studies in Thimphu in Bhutan. And he's also an artist. And the film itself charts the creation of a Buddhist Sun mandala, which is dedicated to the tantric goddess Vajrayogini, and it was a fantastic project to work on with him. You can see, I mean, the film is available to watch on the events channel, but this mandala was intricately created by nuns and monks from across Bhutan, and then it was ritually destroyed as an expression of the impermanence of all phenomena. And then out of this also a large-scale tanka, or painting on fabric, of Vajrayogini was created by Dashrakama Ura during this time, and that was also the creation of that tanka was also documented in the film, and that will be acquired and available to view soon at the museum. So that was for me, that was a really sort of fulfilling project that came out of the exhibition. So those were our three main questions for us. So I'm just also aware of the time. I think we're running up to the end of our Q&A. But I think we have time for, let's see, hang on, we've got actually, I think we have time for maybe one more general question. I feel like we could all answer this. Okay, so in terms of the arts and the museum sector, what do you think are the key changes that you hope will be brought forward into a sector-wide way of working? Maybe Aakash, you could talk a little bit about the dance sector. What do you think? What do you think are the key changes that you hope are going to be brought forward sector-wide in the dance sector?
Well, I hope, generally speaking, as well as a dancer, it's not one rule fits all. I think this is really important to remember, that we work in ecosystems. If one thing I've realized is the power of cross-pollination. working across discipline, and also not having to apply a rule to every single dance organization, arts organization. I think some form of sensitivity to life, the practice of the artist or the organization. I would hope that this can be part of the new policy making in the arts in general. I hope this year has been a year where we realize the impermanence of life, and also that change is a constant. And this constant sort of sense of being able to evaluate where the artists and practitioners are, so that we don't have outdated systems trying to become the foundation of our organizations. I think if there's anything I would like to take forward, it's about being sensitive to these new ecosystems that are now in development.
Thank you, Aakash. And what about you, Yarli? What are your thoughts on this in relation to the contemporary art scene?
Oh, I don't know how I can top Akash's answer. I mean, yeah, totally. I was going to ask you both actually. Like before the pandemic, I've been moving across countries, and like in the 90s, you don't expect to keep connections with the community after a move, but now we're ever so connected before, and I never felt I've left the country, and just like now I'm participating. And so just thinking about, how do you both think, is it a wake-up call for the organization or institution to rethink how we can share work with the globes and with the audience? Like you have online workshops, Aakash and Imma. Yeah, your show is accessible as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think now more than ever, I mean, in the case of museums like the British Museum, we need to find ways, creative ways of ensuring that the collection is somehow accessible for people all over the world. I mean, we have collections online, which is our online database of the entire collection that people can explore, but how can we make that available in more creative and engaging ways, because essentially that's just a sort of database. How can we create maybe more digital immersive ways of sharing our exhibitions? Yeah, do you have any more thoughts on that, Aakash, from your perspective?
No, I'm just pondering on what Yarli just said right now. And that's such an incredible thing where you said in the 90s where you would move, you lose the connection to your community. And it just made me think, our sense of responsibility has grown and grown and grown and grown because of the connectivity of social media and this, all these different platforms. The sense of the responsibility has become not just to the community, but then to the globe as well. And that's just something that really kind of, and with the advancement of technology and the changes that have happened, the level of responsibilities and pressure has also increased. How do you then make those things meaningful? I think, it's something that I'm going to think on now that you've just said that. And I quickly wrote that down on a paper. Think about this. What is the meaning and of this connectivity, this new transformation?
Brilliant. I feel like that's such a great note to end on. This has been such an inspiring panel. Thank you both so much for that really stimulating discussion, and thank you to the Bagri Foundation for hosting us virtually. And this panel is part of a series of conversations that are running throughout May, discussing recent pivots in the arts sector and new visions for the future. So do tune in for the next ones on the 18th and the 25th of May on navigating a changing world and navigating risk and reward. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and Aakash, Imma. It's been wonderful.